Somebody once told me, they characterized my position as a historian slumming it in the sociology department, which I thought was a wonderfully apt way to put it. After all, my PhD is in history. But you know, I read sociology while I was doing my doctorate, and I was never really a good fit in the history department, which I discovered quite quickly when I was applying for jobs. I was just kind of an odd place as an historical sociologist, which is very much how I think of myself. And really, there's very little different from what I do than what any sociologist of social movements or human rights does. Having said that, when I did shift to the disciplines formally, I did notice some interesting differences in the way we do things. For instance, I think that sociologists are much better trained when it comes to methodology and much better trained when it comes to theory. On the other hand, I think historians are better trained when it comes to using diversity of sources. And historians place a greater emphasis, I think, on developing context in their research, I think, than sociologists do. So some of the intellectual differences I discovered when I had to do my shift. But there was some interesting kind of professional differences as well, too. For example, historians love a nice, clean narrative when we write, for articles and for books, nice, clean narrative. Sociologists are so mechanical in the way they write, introduction, data, methodology, discussion, then the explanation, then the conclusion. And there's this bizarre habit I've noticed, especially for dissertations, where people will write 15 pages and then explain what they just wrote in the past 15 pages. And then they'll write 15 pages and explain what they just wrote in the past 15 pages. So when previously I've just explained this and talked about this, now I'm going to go on and talk about this. And then 15 pages later, so I just talked about that. Now I'm going to explain this. It's been 15 pages. I remember what you said, actually, so that's okay. And there's other things, too, like in-text citations. I hate in-text citations. I'm citing 30 or 40 historical documents in a single article. If I have to do an in-text citation, I've done about 6 articles in-text citations. It's pure torture. You just have to do so many different references. Sociologists actually are also more likely to hire research assistants than historians. You might not have known that, but it's actually more common to see sociologists fund RAs in their grant applications than sociologists are. And teams, research teams are far more common among sociologists than they are among historians. So there's a lot of really interesting disciplinary differences. But more relevant to what we're talking about today, the one that really stands out, it's an interesting comment that I've heard from my colleagues in the department, usually in graduate admissions and awards and hiring committees. Somebody will almost invariably say, what is sociological about this? Which is an interesting question. I've never seen an historian in a committee who's looking at an application or a grant for the rebellions of 1837 ask, what's historical about this? But it's been a very useful question I found for my own scholarship. What is sociological about this? And I've discovered that asking that question does offer a unique perspective on my own fields of social movements and human rights. So let me give you an example of how this kind of approach, I think one of the strengths of sociology and the way sociology does offer a unique contribution, if it's done in an interdisciplinary way. So I do it as an historical sociologist. So in the field of human rights, it's been long dominated by political scientists and legal scholars. For them, human rights is an abstract concept. They envision a pre-social individual who exists outside of a society, kind of an abstract person, and then ascribe a series of rights to this person. So whether they're in court or writing political philosophy, they're debating human rights as kind of an abstract principle. But sociologists have long rejected the notion of a universal principle that can exist outside of a society. You can go back to Durkheim and Marx, and the same thing. They completely rejected the very idea. In fact, it's not really until about the late 90s when Brian Turner started writing about human rights that sociologists woke up, so to speak, to the importance of human rights and the way it transformed our societies. And it's really interesting because for a sociologist, this notion of an abstract principle that informs our society doesn't make so much sense as the idea that human rights should be premised on how they're exercised in our society and this capacity of the state and society to enforce those rights. So in other words, unlike a legal scholar or a political scientist, a sociologist is more likely to want to understand the way human rights are practiced in social life, to think of human rights as a particular social practice. So in order to have social meaning, human rights have to become embedded in practices of societal institutions like schools, hospitals, families, the courts, or the government. Which raises a really intriguing possibility that every society has its own unique rights culture, which is a concept that most legal scholars and political scientists will immediately reject out of turn. Well, social historians or historical sociologists have a great deal of affinity with this approach. We think exactly the same way. In fact, one of the most difficult lessons to teach about human rights is that it's a modern concept. Really, human rights has not been popularized only really since the 1970s, at least in Canada and Western Europe and North America. What we understand human rights to be today has only really been practiced for less than a century in our societies. So from this point of view, human rights are historically contingent and therefore specific to every society. Human rights have a social life in that they emerge from shared understandings of what rights should be. This is a very unique and controversial way of thinking about human rights. You know, when I write and I'm dealing with peer reviewers, and 90% of the time, peer reviewers are legal scholars or political scientists, because these are most of the experts in the field, they just instinctively reject the very notion that human rights has only been popularized since the 1970s. For them, human rights is something that we've practiced since the French Revolution, among other things. So it really does show the way sociology as an interdisciplinary study is challenging the dominant ways we've understood about human rights, and it's incredible the burden I'm constantly having to face with other disciplines in order to make these kind of points. So I think an historical sociological approach to human rights can offer a lot of things. It can help us understand how and why human rights have emerged as a powerful social force. They can help us understand how rights are realized in practice. I think this is hugely important compared to a more theoretical, abstract approach. They can help us understand how society resolves competing rights claims. And I think an historical sociological approach to rights can, most importantly, help us understand those social conditions that made rights significant at a particular historical moment. In other words, our contribution to the study of human rights can be, among other things, identifying those societal preconditions, whether it's democracy or capitalism or whatever, that facilitates the popularization of human rights. So I think this is one of the ways in which historical sociology can make a really significant contribution. I mean, don't get me wrong, I still hate in-text citations. I hate writing like that. But you know, for the past generation, I think if the scholarship of the scholars previous generation have really demonstrated anything, is they've shown that these disciplinary boundaries are often an illusion. Just to wrap up, you know, I often remember when I was applying for jobs, it just happened in that particular couple of years, there were quite a few positions in social movements and social justice that I applied for. None in history, all in sociology. Virtually every single sociology department was only willing to hire somebody who had a PhD in sociology. In fact, I almost didn't apply here, just so happened the chair of the department seemed to be open to an historian applying for a job. Otherwise, if it hadn't been for that correspondence, I never even would have bothered to apply here. And I think that's unfortunate. I think that kind of inflexibility blinds us to the necessity of an interdisciplinary approach to the sociology of human rights. And in fact, it's ironic in the sense too, all those departments that didn't want to hire people who didn't have a sociology PhD, my experience, that's uncommon. I think sociology is probably the most interdisciplinary discipline that we have. And it's among our greatest strengths. Certainly these new challenges, these new approaches to human rights have emerged thanks to sociologists and people taking an interdisciplinary approach. So I hope that that is a strength that we continue to build on as we think about the future of our discipline. Thank you.